structure the economy, push it into new sectors, raise productivity. Successful industrial policy requires pragmatism. It is the countries that have shown flexibilities in the tools they use that were more successful in achieving their ultimate goals. Most extreme example is Singapore. 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government, 22% of GDP produced by state-owned enterprises, including the famous Singapore Airlines, 85% of housing is supplied by the government-owned housing corporation called the Housing Board. So, it's an extreme example of a mixture of socialism and capitalism. On the one hand, you have free trade. On the other hand, you have the 90% public ownership of land. So I think this pragmatism is quite important because a lot of policymakers become very ideological and they try to stick to that ideology while the world is moving on and you are not adapting to the changes in the world. And then we come to the issue of implementation capabilities. Effective policy implementation requires capable people, but unlike what most people think, this doesn't mean hiring more economists. For example, when the World Bank, the IMF, when they do capacity building program for policy improvement in developing countries, their idea is basically to send people to Harvard and Oxford to get a degree in economics. Well, let me tell you, the public officials that were behind the so-called East Asian miracle were largely not economists. In Japan, they were almost entirely lawyers. In Korea, there were more economists, but they had very high proportion of lawyers and some engineers. In China, in Taiwan, they are mostly scientists and engineers. And what little economics they knew were not free market economics, not neoclassical economics. Especially in Japan, there's a very strong influence of the economists like Marx, Friedrich List, and Joseph Schumpeter. So they operated with these ideas. Basically, what makes successful policymakers is different from what makes successful economists. These people, they need to know some economics, but they need to have general intelligence, the ability to learn, skills to manage complex projects, and the ability to maintain organizational coherence. What the qualities that are required for good policymakers is not the knowledge of economics. Also, you have to remember that administrative capabilities are not simply possessed by individuals, but also by organizations. So what kind of command structure do you have? What kind of institutional routines you have? How you keep institutional memories? What kind of records and archives do you have? How do you rotate people between jobs so that you do not become silos? How do interdepartmental coordination happens? These things are far more important than what economists usually think. And finally, you need to design good incentive system for the recipients of industrial policy supports. They need to be rewarded and punished according to performance. There are many cases where the government only gave support and never punished non-performers. The old regime in India is a classic example. You had all these infant industries not transitioning into becoming adult industries, but sick industries. So you don't grow up, and then you are under protection for 30, 40 years, and you cannot survive without protection. So that's a clear failure of the incentive system for the recipients of your support. Of course, you need state with embedded autonomy. It has to be a state that is not hostile to business. It has to understand the business world. It has to have channels to discuss things with the business sector, but not beholden to it. Because sometimes you have to make tough decisions and say, well, you've had all this support, nothing has changed, you're going to cut this. If you can announce the targets, if you can announce the performance indicators, and if you can announce the measures that you're going to take if things fail to go in the right way in advance, it becomes more difficult to manipulate them through lobbying. Yeah? So that was the function of this 5-year plans. That was the function of so many industrial policy documents, white papers, green papers, whatever, research outputs from government-related research institute produced in countries like Japan and Korea. And I think one last comment is that the discussion in this lecture shows how the real world is much more complex than economic theories acknowledge. It also shows how economic theories are often behind real-world practices. This supposedly new idea of information externality. I mean, that had been practiced in Malaysia for the last 50 years. I mean, with some mixed success. And it also shows how real-world successes in economic policies have often been made without the contribution of economists. Some may even say that because there was no contribution from economists. Now, I don't want to end this lecture in a negative way by suggesting that economics is useless, but